Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be continuing in our Dissertation 101 series, and specifically talk about selecting a qualitative methodology. Now, I will be discussing qualitative research and specific qualitative methodologies, but our last section will be looking at the process of selecting a specific qualitative approach for research. And for this, I can create examples. But if you have a topic that you're interested in, please type it in the chat room or send me a private message, and then we can use an example that is of interest to you to talk about how a particular issue or problem might be explored using a different qualitative methodologies or approaches. So with that, let's dive in. If you're new to the Writing Center, do check out our webinars on our main writing webinar page. Underneath the schedule, you'll find this tab guide. This webinar and similar ones are clustered under the Dissertations and Doctoral Projects tab. Now, we're going to be looking more or less in 5 sections today. First, we're going to start with a review of some key terminology. We'll talk about qualitative methodology, broadly speaking, then zero in on specific qualitative methods, approaches, or designs, depending on your terminology. Then we'll talk about the data collection and finish with an exercise of looking at, for a particular task or problem or issue that you're investigating, what method, approach, or design you might select. So I encourage questions throughout the process. I have worked in this research for some years, so I know plenty of things about this, but what I don't know are the questions that you have. So if you have a question, please feel free to type into the chat room, or if you'd rather message me privately, you can just in the chat box, select everyone, and then there'll be a drop down, select my name, Basil Considine, and you can send that message to me privately. All right, so let's talk about some key terminology here. And let's differentiate from some things that might come up, like interview questions versus research questionnaires, and the research questions themselves. And if you're wondering why we're talking about questions as a lead into a methodology, because they're very closely related. Because the types of data that you're looking for that will determine whether this is a qualitative study, a quantitative study, or a mixed method study, well, if you have a question that can really only be answered using some sort of numerical analysis, then we're going to need to be asking questions or collecting data in that way. And so if you pick one first, then you need to keep in mind that that's locking you into a certain path. And so if we start with first the problem, select the subset of the problem, make our purpose to address that subset of the problem, find out, okay, well, what information do we need? What research questions are we trying to answer? And then look at, okay, so what's the best way to answer those? Then that leads us towards our methodology. So to differentiate between these three, interview questions or prompts are the specific statements or questions that you pose to your participants, that you ask or prompt them with to collect data. Now, a research questionnaire is some data collection instrument that has a specific series of questions or prompts. And you can ask people it in person, you can have them fill out an online survey or a paper one, and you can even take these and ask them people in an interview or use them as a starting point in an interview. As opposed to the research questions that are the larger questions that you're going to take your data that you've collected and analyze that data to answer. Another important thing is to consider whether you're doing action research, where you are trying to address a problem or issue, or whether you're doing so-called pure or basic research, which is designed to gain a better understanding of a subject, a phenomenon, or some sort of condition without necessarily trying to solve it. Let me give you an example. Journalistic research often involves a lot of different data collection, but usually the goal is to report on what something's going on. there may be some broader attention of call attention to these things that the public should know, but in general, journalistic research is aimed more at the advancing of knowledge or the publicizing of knowledge rather than changing something. Now, if we look at a newspaper, an editorial is often written as something to induce action. You're writing about something because you're saying, hey, this is important, whatever that should be. So which type of research are you going to be doing? And in most of our doctoral programs, you're going to be doing action research where there's a specific thing that you are trying to fix, to improve, to solve, or remediate. So when you're selecting the research design, again, we go back to, well, what questions are you trying to answer? And what type or types of evidence do you need to answer them? And from that, how can you get this data? And is that something that's been previously collected or published? Now, I have invited some submissions of different topics that people are interested in. And so we're going to be looking at some examples related to that. So someone has written in with a request or a topic suggestion for bullying in public schools. So just to do a quick illustration, I've gone ahead and I've done a search in Google Scholar. I typed in bullying in public schools, and I'm not really interested in things, say, from the 1970s. I want to know about things in the present day. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a search since 2019. So roughly the last 5 years or so. And I'm looking for things that might have a particular connotation. So let's say that I am looking at this first example here, where it says promoting a culture of bullying, understanding the role of school climate and school sector. All right, so if we look here, we pop open this PDF. Hold on a minute as it catches up with us. Oh, there we go. So our goal is to find out what their research question or questions they were trying to answer, and then see how they went about doing that. How did they select their methodology? Now, we could do a search for research question. Not every author will write that out explicitly, so we might have a goal or something like that that is listed instead, saying, our goal is to understand this. And we find here, this article seeks to understand this finding by analyzing the roles that school climate and school sector play in creating school environments. So if I was to rephrase that as a question, the question is, what roles do school climate and school sector play in creating school environments? And you could separate that to individual questions. What role does school climate play? And what role does school sector play? And have those be the secondary questions to answer the primary question. Well, what roles do they play together? All right, so we have some idea of the purpose of this study and the question that they're trying to answer. So let's look at how they went doing it. And so they've identified a conceptual framework. And I will say that this study is, it appears to be a literature review. And they used the school crime supplement in statistical analysis. So if we look at this, we see they wanted to find, did this predict X? And if you're trying to determine that, is this thing a marker, a possible sign, or a possible indication of the cause, that is absolutely the kind of thing you want to do with numbers. So the fact that they did a quantitative study is very appropriate for that. Now, if I were to add the word qualitative here, usually that where that comes in is where there's something that you don't think has been documented well, or hasn't been specifically documented. And so you're trying to find out what is happening first, and then you can go and look at the details for how much. So in this case, we have another one here. So let's go ahead and bring up this article here. Now we see here, they say that they're doing a qualitative investigation. Well, let's find out what the problem or purpose was here and what the research questions were. Now we see here, their goal was to inform future intervention efforts. Okay. And then they have more specific. They wanted to characterize and compare the perspectives of two groups on two topics. All right. Well, if they're doing this because it hasn't been done in the literature, usually your first step will be to do a qualitative study. And they tell us a little bit more here. They were using this particular guide, the rapid qualitative inquiry. And they started with focus groups. Now, just because something is qualitative in nature doesn't mean that you won't end up with something that can be added. In this case, they did some sort of coding to say, okay, well, of the people we interviewed, 23 of them, 82% of the group reported X. And then this is one of those things that you want to read carefully. So 82% reported witnessing or experiencing bullying. By contrast, only 32% of the SHPs is reported that they'd ever seen that. So this is the portion that never witnessed that. So we see here that there's a dramatic difference in perspective here, but they gain that starting from their qualitative data collection. And sometimes people will also do a qualitative inquiry because the topic matter may make people less inclined to fill out a survey. And this is why some surveys will have warnings, this may cause you to experience some psychological distress, et cetera, et cetera. All right, back to our slides here. So once you've figured out what kind of information or evidence you need to answer your questions, the question becomes, well, how can you get the data? Is this something that's out there that's been collected and published earlier, collected but not published, or is not being collected or published? And the answer for that study we were just looking at was not collected or published. So let's do some more differentiation of terminology. So it is a common approach to use methodology and methods synonymously. This is very confusing because you might have someone say, oh, I'm not sure what your methods are. And another one says, oh, yeah, you're using qualitative methods. So I will suggest that we use methodology to refer to whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, and that you use approach or design to refer to the specific subset of that. For example, a qualitative case study analysis or a qualitative multiple comparative case study or phenomenological study or grounded theory, etc. So before you select a methodology, I always recommend that you review the broader types of research methods. And then once you've confirmed which one you want to take, to look at the more specific ones and ask, is this something that you can do practically? Is this something that has been done already? And you can find that out with a quick literature search. Is this something where you want to align your study with previous literature or not? As an example, you will see in that article we were looking at, they mentioned that they were using the rapid quality inquiry. And so by doing their work using that framework, they were able to create something that is more comparable to other studies using the same procedure. And so that's very valuable, especially if you're trying to expand the pool of data that's usable for something. So you may very well select your exact approach and methodology based on what other people have done so that you can follow directly or build on their work. It's also helpful to assess your comfort and familiarity. While mixed methods research is very powerful and very good at doing things like showing causation, it is also more time consuming, more difficult, and generally takes more space to write up. So it's not recommended for a first research project. We almost always will counsel doctoral students to use qualitative or quantitative rather than mixed methods for that reason. You can always follow up with mixed methods research, but if you haven't done it before, it's usually not the best time to start. So I would encourage you to discuss your ideas with faculty. You go and say, okay, well, I read the literature, here's what they've been doing, and here's why I believe this is appropriate. And sometimes you'll get access to things that you didn't expect that might change that, or you might be made aware of other factors. So one of my students was preparing to do their study using a certain database, and their faculty said, oh, actually, you don't want to use that because I have access to this other thing that's bigger. And so they changed their study based on the data that was available. Now, you can also do a search to see what data is related to your topic, and I'd absolutely recommend making an appointment with a research librarian. And with that, let's talk specifically about qualitative research now. Some quick reminders. There is a list of advanced resources at the end of most of the chapters in Creswell's book. If you don't have the complete book, this is a great time to borrow it from the library or buy it. And in one of the reasons to look at research that other people have done on this general topic is that you don't have to, and often shouldn't be, trying to reinvent the wheel. All right, here are a couple of resources that you can use if you're doing research in particular areas. These are all almost all freely accessible, or you can do a request through the ACU online library to get a chapter. All right, and as you are looking into this, you should always ask, are there any concerns about patient or participant privacy that would require that you do anonymization, that you take steps to encrypt or otherwise obscure or obfuscate their identity by anonymizing data? Are there legal requirements that are governing this? And especially if this is something where you might want to use the data in future research, what do you need to do now to ensure that? And quick questions. Are you working with human subjects, or are you working with data from human subjects? If your answer to either of these is yes, then you're going to want to talk with the ACU IRB. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be a ton of work, but you do want to make sure that you've done your due diligence, both in terms of participant protection and following best practices, documenting, and even if it's already anonymized data from another site, make sure that you have their ruling saying, hey, this is exempt, you don't need to go through us anymore. So what is qualitative research? Well, let me quote from one of the seminal articles on the topic. Qualitative research is an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and sometimes counterdisciplinary field. It crosses the humanities and the social and physical sciences. Qualitative research is many things at the same time. It is multi-paradigmatic in focus. Its practitioners are sensitive to the value of the multi-method approach. They're committed to the naturalistic perspective and to the interpretive understanding of human experience. At the same time, the field is inherently political and shaped by multiple ethical and political positions. A little bit about that last one. I don't mean that all qualitative research will cause political problems, but these authors are highlighting that often qualitative research is used to call attention to some issue that has not been accepted, embraced, or acknowledged in the mainstream. And because this is usually done for reasons of changing something, whether it's policy or funding, that is something that can become political fast. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So you select qualitative research where there's something where people's subjective experiences are something that you are trying to acquire, to assess, to evaluate, where that it's not something you can just count how many people were involved in this, but your answer are more why were this, or what does this mean? What are you trying to make sense of? How do you interpret this? And once you've done that, you can by all means count that and compare, look at the proportions. But we're starting with the personal lens or experience being an important aspect of it. Now, some of the benefits of doing qualitative versus quantitative, well, it's usually much cheaper and often faster. There's a large capacity for understanding what people, especially consumers, have to say about something. It's generally used to justify the investment of further resources. So if you're doing research in a new area or sub-area, often the pilot study will be qualitative, and then you come back and do a quantitative study or a mixed method study next. And it's a great guide for quantitative research. There are many surveys that were developed from a pilot study that used interviews or focus groups. And because you had that initial way, you know what kinds of questions to write to get the answers you need. Some of its limits, well, it's often not as good for showing small differences, and you're usually working with a smaller population than quantitative research. So it's harder to say that, okay, well, in general, nationwide, 70%, because you might say, well, 70% of our focus group said that, but we're not sure if that's representative of the larger country. And we're inherently looking at a smaller slice. And there are lots of people who do qualitative research, and I'd say don't always do it with the greatest vigor or the most responsible approach. So again, please make sure to contact the IRB and get their approval. The IRB exists both to help protect you and to protect the participants. So often they'll make minor suggestions like, oh, do this to help ensure that the data remains private. All right, so let's dive into qualitative research a little bit more. So we're talking about research that involves studying, collecting materials through a variety of mechanisms. We could be extrapolating things into a case study. We could be collecting personal experiences, looking at introspective insights into something, asking people about their life stories. So if, for example, if your goal is to find, say, what are the recommended habits for being happy late in life, we could be collecting life stories and saying, well, okay, what did you do? And that may change throughout the course of the lifespan, but we're extrapolating those from collecting that life story. Or perhaps a more focused interview, observational, where you go in and look at people. I remember one fascinating observational study of people at a conference, and they looked at how often people were smiling and frowning. And that was observational because they're just looking at it. They weren't trying to change, just to understand what was going on. Here's a spoiler. People looked the unhappiest in the business meetings. Historical, interactional, visual text. Now, when you're doing qualitative research, you can use a variety of different approaches to get things, but usually there's some main focus there. All right, so let's talk about the most common qualitative methods. First, case study research. This is something that many of you are probably very familiar with from having done case study analyses and write-ups in your coursework. Now, case study research is saying we're looking at something and seeing what kind of themes or lessons we can extract from this. Or by applying a particular approach or model to the case study, what does that suggest we should do? Phenomenological, we're looking at, okay, what's going on and why. Ethnography, we are looking at something embedded in culture, that the environment is inseparable in some shape or form. Uh, I'll give an example. One of my colleagues is a very avid fiddler and dulcimer player, and she goes to these music music festivals in the mountain, and you go and you pitch your tent and you do a lot of partying and playing music. And I would guess, although I haven't explicitly asked, I would guess that there's an awful lot of drinking. And when she tells me about the things that they do at these festivals, I'm like, huh, that's a little weird, but they're traditions. There's some things that they've done since the very first festival. And while it may seem a little bit weird, it's that history, that cultural context is very much important to why these people keep gathering year after year and do things that I personally would rather not, like camping on the top of a mountain in a snowstorm to play music. Uh, by all means, I love playing music. I'm just not big on doing it in an uninsulated tent in the middle of a snowstorm. But these people do. And so if you're trying to understand that, we want to be understanding that context as a key for interpreting what's going on and the meaning. Now, grounded theory is when you are looking at something that's going on and you're trying to create a theory to explain that. That is, I would say, usually something that when you're looking at a new or emergent phenomenon that you want to do it. And if it's something that's more mature, where there's a lot of literature and you're just expanding it to a particular context or population, then you would probably be doing another type of research. But for example, I remember when Amazon.com, when the whole concept of internet mail delivery was really starting to take shape, and there was a rather massive splurge of people doing grounded theory research, trying to explain what was going on, because it was such a big and such a fast shift in consumer behavior, from buying most everything from stores around you to, oh, let's order, say, paper towels online. If you're doing research on that these days, you probably wouldn't be doing grounded theory unless there's something new, very paradigm changing new. Observational, we talked about this earlier. This is where you're primarily interested in looking and documenting what's going on. You're not trying to change things so much as, oh, here's this thing that goes on. And actually, marketing people are often very interested in observational things. Just ask any parent who starts getting things in the mail around the time that their baby is born. That's a lot of stuff that comes out of observational research. Narrative, this is where the storytelling and how people tell their stories is foregrounded. I would say that I've seen some narrative of dissertations at ACU. It's one of the less common ones. The most common ones that I do see are ethnography, case study, phenomenological. Occasionally I do see the other three, but ethnography, case study, and phenomenological are the most common qualitative methods that I see people using. Okay, so we have a little time here to look at some examples. So I'll again invite you to share some topics that we might use as examples. But while we're talking about qualitative data collection methods, so surveys or questionnaires, you might be thinking, well, hold on, isn't a survey inherently quantitative? Well, it depends on the questions that are being asked. If it's something where you are asking people to pick, A, B, C, or D, yes. If it's something where these are open-ended questions and it just happens that a survey is the format that you're collecting this information, well, there'll probably be a lot of qualitative interpretation of these thoughts that people write down. So another way to collect qualitative data would be to be doing an interview. And the two main types, you've got structured, where you come in and you ask everyone the same questions. You don't diverge from that question list. Or semi-structured, where you do interview people and you have a list of questions, but you can ask follow-ups. There are also truly open-ended or non-structured interviews. Uh, they're used less because usually people are doing that when their goal is just to get a little information on something and they're not trying to answer a specific research question. So a lot of people will do professional interviews where it's, kind of a networking thing, kind of a, I want to learn about this. Will you share some of your insight kind of thing? Focus groups, you saw this listed in one of the articles we looked at. Focus groups are another way to collect qualitative data. And often people are more forthcoming about some topics in focus groups and less forthcoming on other things. So generally, if it's something where people perceive that there might be some social stigma, and it's not something where everyone in that group also identifies with that, then you might find yourself doing one-on-one interviews rather than focus groups, because people might be reluctant to divulge something and potentially feel judged by other people there. And just as an example for the people in the nursing program, it's probably no surprise that sexually transmitted diseases are, or sexually transmitted infections, as we more commonly call them now, are high on that list of things that people just don't like talking about in public. Now, I've worked in pediatric and adult emergency rooms. There are lots of things where people won't tell you why they came in until their parent or friend or partner leaves the room. And that's exactly the kind of thing where you might decide to do focus groups and also have interviews to see if there's any notable change. And in that particular case I was telling you about, when we find a patient who is very evasive on something, then in the pediatric context, we will ask the parent to step out because there's a legal obligation to treat and legal confidentiality provided. But you're not going to find what the actual issue is if the problem is someone else is there. And that is why interviews are almost always done privately. While you can do a group interview, it's usually like a collection of coworkers on something that is not deemed to, the answers are not expected to have any repercussions for the people there because the group is already in some sort of agreement on that. And of course, observations, which we mentioned earlier. There are ways we can do records or archival reviews. I had one dissertation where they were looking at the way that different flyers were created in a particular environment. And so they were looking at that and they were making qualitative judgments on, oh yes, was this fun? Was this businesslike? Was it stern? The wash your hands and posters, those went through a variety of different iterations. And so that they were using that, but looking at them qualitatively. Okay, before we wrap up, we're going to look at another example because a student has offered another topic here. So we're going to head back to our friend Google Scholar. And you can certainly do this in the ACU library catalog. But what I want to emphasize is that if you're just trying to do a quick orientation, you don't need to go through the business of logging in. So the topic we've been given here is emergency department, visits, and for asthma. Now, looking at this, we see we have no shortage of literature here. We have more than 150,000 results. So right away, if we want to look at things that are current, I don't think we're going to have a problem, even if we set this to only be 2021 to present. We still have 15,000. It's not a shortage here. So let's go take a look at parents, pediatrics, and we'll even do a search for qualitative. Still have more than 2,000. So if you look at the title here, this is before we've clicked through for anything. It tells us barriers to implementation of pediatric emergency department interventions for parental tobacco use and dependence, a qualitative study using blah, blah, blah. So just looking at this, we see not only is it qualitative research, but we have some idea of why it probably was qualitative research, because there are certain behaviors that are good or bad, stigmatized, and that people are often reluctant to answer truthfully, authentically, or at all if it's in a group setting or if it's on a questionnaire. One of the truisms is that people who drink will almost always de-emphasize the amount that they're drinking. So it's, oh yeah, we'll have maybe 1 or 2 beers. And if you look at something that examines people just setting after they've filled out that survey, usually it'll be more than that. Like, oh, yeah, 2 to 4, not 1 to 2, for example. So if you're evaluating interventions, you probably want to talk with people one-on-one and say, what's important to you? So let's take a look at this one here. All right, so looking at this, we see this is from peer-reviewed journal. We have their methods. So they were using semi-structured focused interviews. So this means that the interviews were on a particular topic. Semi-structured means they had a questionnaire coming in, but they could ask additional questions. And specifically, the interview guide was following the theoretical domains framework that's listed up here. And they specifically included open-ended questions. So things that aren't just yes, no, or this number, but things that invite people to expound. And so they then did a content analysis of the transcripts. Now, we can see that this is aimed at practitioners, nurses, physicians, and their administrators. And we see that they were looking to see, did the results fall into a set of domains prescribed in the theoretical domains framework? And let's just look down here at their results, because if you're thinking about what kind of information do you need to know to answer your research questions, to answer your to address your problem, then you probably want to see, well, other people doing this kind of research, what have they gotten? And you can see that they asked people some standard demographics things, including the level of education here, about their tobacco use. And you can see, here's a case. 2 people decided that they did not want to answer that. Now that's 2 people out of a larger set. I'm sorry, that's 1 person. This column here is breaking down physician. So 1 person out of 29, somewhere around 3.4, 3.5%. That's not bad to have a little missing data. That's fine. Now, if we look through here, see what else, we have things like how much they worked, number of patients they cared for, how long they've been in this job, and other things like that. So yeah, helpful context to know. Now, if we go back and look at the factors that they listened to, that they listed, rather, we can see that there are these themes, and they can see some things like, oh, none of the administrators said that there was a problem with there not being enough knowledge. Now, that's exactly the kind of perspective you might expect from an administrator who writes memos and says, okay, do this, don't do that, etc. Well, it's a different matter to implement, to follow through, and to actually read the things. So the administrators may feel that they've provided all the information. The nurse and physician may disagree. But you can see some broad trends here. There's a lot of agreement. People in each of the groups was mentioning these things as barriers being perceived. And looking at this, you can see, all right, that is pretty consistent across those categories. Let's look at this one. And keep in mind, this is all derived from looking at the transcripts of the interviews and then coding these themes and domains. We see, oh, there is pretty universal agreement in all 3 categories. All right. And let's look at that last table. Again, we see some divergence on the administrative front. Now, if we're talking about patients, you could say, well, okay, this seems to make sense. The nurses and the physicians are the ones who are interacting with the patients all the time. So they will absolutely be smelling tobacco smoke if the patients have come in right after smoking. And while the administrators are usually not going to be in the emergency department except on the occasional inspection or some meeting or something. And so it's completely to be expected that their perspective might diverge. But we have these themes now. So you could take this research and then create a questionnaire to do follow-up and find out, well, okay, what percentage of nurses think this? What percentage of physicians do that? What percentages of administrator do? And you might even design that survey to have some questions to figure out, are there differences in, say, professional development paths? Some people go right into administration out of school. Other people find themselves in administration after they've worked in a professional group, like being a nurse or a physician. And so this is an example of, we have the initial qualitative study. And if you're following up on that, very likely you would ask some additional questions because you've noticed that there's some differences. And now you want to find out how broad those are and are they meaningful in their frequency. So I think that's where we're going to wrap today. Does anyone have any questions on things that they'd like us to explain or expound on?